This is a stick-up.
Nobody move!
The movie Dog Day Afternoon features Al Pacino as a bank robber whose summertime heist goes terribly wrong.
Did you have a plan or what? What did you do, just barge in on a whim?
But he's no ordinary criminal. One of the film's biggest twists is that he's robbing the bank to pay for his transgender girlfriend's surgery.
You needed money? I got your money. That's it.
Well, I didn't ask you to go and rob a bank.
And the even bigger twist? It all really happened.
One of the strangest hijack attempts to date began yesterday when two gunmen held up a bank in Brooklyn, New York.
Based on a real-life bank robber whose queer heist stunned the world.
One of those stunning examples of the truth being so strange, it becomes super fiction.
Dog Day Afternoon was on the cutting edge of a revolution in film, changing the way that audience saw queer characters on screen.
Do you know this is out of our hands? This thing is its own life.
But that revolution was a lot more fragile than anyone realized. This is the story of Dog Day Afternoon, the real-life queer caper that helped change American film, and the forces that are still trying to change it back. Our story starts in the summer of 1971. A man named John Wadowitz is walking with his girlfriend, Liz Eden, down Grant Street in New York's Little Italy. They stop in front of a window to admire a beautiful white wedding dress. Liz says it's the most beautiful gown she ever saw. "I'll get it for you on one condition," says John. "You have to marry me in it." Now that's a lovely way to propose. But there was just one problem. Marrying Liz was against the law. That's because Liz was trans, and in the 1970s, the government considered her a man. A few years earlier, a trans woman named Christine Jorgensen had tried to get married in New York, and a clerk refused to allow it on the basis that, he ruled, she was born male. That set a precedent that courts followed even into the 2000s. But John wasn't going to let that stop him. He'd been married once already, to a woman named Carmen Bafulco. It had only lasted a couple years, but he loved the attention that he got on his wedding day, and he wanted to try again with Liz. John knew that queer groups had been trying to change New York's marriage laws to be more inclusive. Just a few weeks earlier, he'd been part of a group called the Gay Activists Alliance that marched into the office of the clerk who turned Christine Jorgensen down and demanded a change in policy. Gay power! Gay power! The Gay Activists Alliance was familiar with John, too. He'd been to a handful of their meetings, although not always as an activist. He saw it as a good place to go cruising. A few months earlier, he'd caused a minor scandal when the GAA leaders learned that he'd been hooking up with members on a mattress in the basement. At GAA meetings, John was known as Little John. According to some people, the nickname was a reference to how short he was, and according to others,
little is because my prick is little.
Whatever the case, after the marriage counter protest, Little John stood up at a GAA meeting, and he told them that he wanted the organization to go one step further. He wanted to hold a wedding, and he thought the GAA should host it at their headquarters. If anyone would support this idea, it seemed like it ought to be them. But GAA leaders weren't so sure. The discussion was led by a guy named Arthur Evans. Arthur was no stranger to controversy. Here he is leading the confrontational invasion of the clerk's office. When he wasn't organizing marches and protests in the city, he was working on a book about the power of gay witchcraft. But as boundary-pushing as Arthur's interests were, Little John's idea rubbed him the wrong way. Demanding legal recognition was one thing, but holding a ceremony was something else. Arthur worried if word got out to the media, straight people might consider it too bizarre, and gay people might consider it too square. He argued that they shouldn't try to imitate straight ceremonies, that it would perpetuate the worst of heterosexual lifestyles. And as a venue, the Gay Activists Alliance headquarters didn't exactly make sense because it was a cis man marrying a trans woman, although many people at the time simply didn't see it that way. Little John was still determined to marry Liz, somehow. He was envisioning a big, lavish affair. But he didn't have any money. According to some friends, he'd been fired from his job as a bank teller when they found out he was bisexual, and he'd been secretly living on welfare ever since. And, of course, there was an even bigger challenge: how they could possibly have a wedding when it wasn't legal. During this time, Liz was getting counseling from a Catholic priest named Father John. She told him, "I'm all mixed up. I have to marry the boy I introduced you to." She said if she couldn't, she was thinking about trying to end her life. Father John tried to comfort her. He told her that he couldn't marry them, but he could perform a blessing. As he put it, a union between two persons who promised to be loyal to each other. He hoped he could save Liz's life by erasing her deep feeling of shamefulness. The priest's blessing got them one step closer to a ceremony, but Little John didn't want this to be a small affair. He wanted something huge, ostentatious. When he'd gotten married the first time, his wife's father had offered to pay. John figured he could probably count on similar generosity from wedding guests this time around. So he emptied out the last of his savings, he borrowed money from some loan sharks, he rented the back room of a restaurant, according to some without telling the restaurant exactly what they were planning, and on a Saturday afternoon in December, Liz and John walked down a makeshift aisle surrounded by giant bouquets and several hundred friends. Liz was wearing the glamorous dress she'd admired in the window. John felt that she was upstaging him, so he wore a military uniform to steal back some of the spotlight. John's mother was in attendance. A reporter named Randy Wicker came.
I didn't know John, but I heard there was going to be this wedding, and I said, I have to videotape this because, first of all, I don't think I'd ever heard of a gay wedding.
As did a reporter for a Brooklyn-based magazine called Drag. Drag magazine covered, as they described it, drag queens, transvestites, and transsexuals. And just a heads up, terminology back then was quite different from today, so throughout the story, some of the historical accounts and interviews are going to use words and names and pronouns that are out of date now. Drag magazine printed a lovely photo spread of Liz and Little John's ceremony, and afterwards they took photos outside, and a bunch of cops from the police station across the street cheered for them, not realizing that they were queer. All in all, it was a happy and tasteful day. But it didn't take long for trouble to emerge. Among the guests at the wedding were several of Little John's loan sharks, and they started leaning on John for repayment at the reception. And when he checked to see how much guests had donated, he found a grand total of $147 and a collection of dildos. He gave the loan sharks what he could. Unfortunately, there's no record of who wound up getting the dildos, and he promised he'd come up with the thousands more that he owed them somehow. A far worse aspect of their married life was John's violent temper. Liz later wrote that if she even looked at another man, he would fly into a rage. John started brawls at bars, he would scream at Liz and accuse her of infidelity. One of the biggest issues between them was Liz's desire to get gender affirmation surgery, what was then called a sex change operation.
I understand that John was very opposed to this operation when you first told him that you wanted it a few months ago.
Yes, he was. He didn't want me to have it because he didn't know what his reactions would be to me after the sex change.
He refused to use feminine pronouns for Liz, and only called her by her former name. That was deeply painful for her, and for the next few weeks, they fought constantly. And then, one night, when John was getting particularly angry, Liz got scared that he might hurt her. In her telling of events, Liz grabbed a knife and locked herself in a bathroom for protection. John kicked down the door and beat her until a neighbor called the police. Liz decided she'd had enough. She walked out. But John wouldn't leave her alone. He'd send letters professing his love, pleading for her to return, and threatening her life. She told him to leave her alone. She went so far as to grow a mustache, hoping that if he saw her on the street, he wouldn't recognize her. But one night, she was working at a job-tending bar, and John came in. He begged her to come back, and she told him no, that she needed to work so she could pay for her surgery herself. Now, that was no small feat back then. In the United States, there were very few doctors willing to perform those operations. By the early 70s, only a few hundred people had gone through the procedure in the US. Liz had found a surgeon, but he wanted over $2,500. Not an easy amount to raise on part-time work behind a bar. John told her he'd get her the money she needed. He never said how, and she didn't want to ask. Her 26th birthday was just a few days away, and he insisted on spending it with her. Liz begged him to leave her alone. Every visit from him made her miserable because it ended in a fight, and she felt like the rest of her life was spiraling too. She couldn't hold down a steady job because few places wanted to hire a trans woman. She only had a handful of friends. Even Father John, the priest who'd blessed their ceremony, now said it was a huge mistake, and he soon abandoned the priesthood altogether and was excommunicated. Worst of all, the surgery that Liz knew that she needed seemed impossibly out of reach. Liz later wrote, "All I could think about was how horrible my life was. Here I was, 26, and nothing was right, nor had it ever been." Before John could return, Liz decided to take a handful of sleeping pills, thinking it would be enough to end her life. Alone in her apartment, she started to shake uncontrollably, to foam at the mouth, and then she passed out.
And then the next thing I remember is I was in Kings County Hospital.
Somebody called Liz and called an ambulance. John came to see her at the hospital, and according to him, that's when he made the decision that would change the rest of their lives. He told Liz he had a way to get the money she needed. So, what was he cooking up? Accounts vary, but what most people agree on is that for months, John had been trying to talk a few friends into robbing a bank. He told them that he was deep with the mafia, and they would help. Most people had figured out by now that Little John wasn't someone they ought to trust, but other people believed him. Among them was an 18-year-old named Sal Naturel, who'd served time for larceny and drug possession, and a 20-year-old named Bobby Westenberg. Westenberg later told people that he and Sal needed money so they could move to California and open a boutique together. And John later said his sole motivation was to pay for Liz's operation. Although he was still in debt to loan sharks for the wedding, so it's possible he was just trying to get them off his back. In any case, their big talk started to turn into actual plans in August of 1972. According to some sources, John might have had some inside help from a Chase bank executive that he met at a gay bar who told him when armored trucks delivered cash to the banks. John saw an opportunity. With Sal and Bobby, they locked in their plans. They'd arrive at a bank in the afternoon, just after the delivery, so the vault would be full of cash. They'd hold up the place at gunpoint. Sal and Bobby could flee to California. John could get Liz the money for the operation. Everybody would live happily ever after. What could possibly go wrong? 2 days after Liz was hospitalized, John, Sal, and Bobby decided to make their move. To amp themselves up,
Before we went to the bank, we decided to go to 42nd Street to watch The Godfather for inspiration.
up on the screen, they watched Al Pacino's character and his violent rise to the head of a crime family, sure that their life of crime would be just as cool. And then, on August 22nd, they drove around New York looking for a bank to rob. They stopped at one at Delancey and Essex, but as they were getting out of the car, Bobby dropped his shotgun and it went off. They panicked, grabbed the gun, jumped in the car, and peeled off. Once they calmed down, they pulled up to another bank and headed inside. Sal was about to pull out his gun when somebody called out, "How you doing, Bobby?" It was a friend of his mother's who'd recognized him. The guys panicked again and ran again. So then they headed to a third bank. They drove around the block to make sure they could make an easy getaway, but they were so nervous they wound up crashing into another car. And the driver was so furious, they were about to call the police, so the guys panicked and zoomed off a third time. By now, it was getting late in the afternoon, and they arrived at a fourth bank, a Chase branch in Park Slope. They marched in wearing iridescent sharkskin suits and mirrored sunglasses. According to John, his gun was concealed in a box that looked like a giant case of Wrigley gum. According to other witnesses, it was simply wrapped in paper. Bobby took up a position near the door. John stood near the tellers, and Sal headed over to the manager, slipped him a note. They typed up the note the night before when they saw The Godfather. It said they were heavily armed, they wanted all the money in the vault, and concluded, "This is an offer you can't refuse." It was at this point in the robbery that Bobby started to think, maybe this wasn't such a good idea. He slipped over to John and he said, "I can't do it," and then ran. After backing out of 3 heists already that day, maybe John and Sal should have followed him. But instead, John decided to plow ahead, and he said, "This is a holdup," or something like that. Here's the manager describing their initial impression of the robbers.
I think after 10 minutes you knew they were amateurs, that they were not professional bank robbers.
John told Sal to hold the employees at gunpoint while they emptied out the vault, and that's when he discovered the armored truck had indeed come by that day, but not to drop money off, to pick it up. Instead of the expected cash in the vault, which would have been equivalent to over $1 million today, there was an amount just about equivalent to $200,000. He barely had time to process that when he heard the first sirens outside. In the few minutes since the start of the robbery, the bank manager had managed to slip a secret signal to a colleague at another branch without the robbers ever noticing. We don't have time for the whole story about how he did that here, but I'm posting a bonus video over on Patreon that goes into lots more detail about all the mistakes that Sal and John made during this heist. That's at patreon.com/mattbaum. The point is, within just a few minutes of their arrival, word got out. And what was supposed to be a fast, simple robbery now had them surrounded by dozens of cops, the media, and the FBI. John and Sal didn't want to give up. They decided this was changing from a simple bank heist to a hostage situation. They held the bank employees at gunpoint while John went outside to negotiate with the police. An army of cops were waiting for him outside. John was agitated, worried that the cops would just start shooting with no regard for human life. And that was a reasonable concern. A year earlier, inmates at a prison in Attica, New York had rioted over inhumane conditions. And in response, cops unleashed a barrage of gunfire, killing 33 inmates and 10 guards. Knowing the police were trigger-happy, John came out and started barking orders at them to stay back or he'd shoot the hostages. So, what was his plan? Well, he didn't really have one. At this point, he was just trying to buy some time so they could figure out an escape. As thieves, they were so bumbling that the bank employees started to feel bad for them. Despite the guns and the threats, one of the tellers said, "I tried to be nice. If they'd been my house guests on a Saturday night, it would have been hilarious." Meanwhile, the crowd outside kept growing. Neighbors started gathering at the police barricades to watch. And looking out the window, John started to realize that the attention might be a form of protection. He later told people, "We knew they were coming to blow us away, but he thought that if they had reporters watching, they wouldn't dare. The more publicity we got, the safer we were." So he started doing interviews from inside the bank, talking to reporters on the phone.
"We're waiting to negotiate the release of the people so we can get out of here."
And showboating for the crowd, tossing thousands of dollars to onlookers who cheered every time they saw him. He started to feel a little more confident. He even told people to call him Big John now, instead of his old nickname, Little John. And gradually, a plan kinda came together. John and Sal told the police they wanted a limo to take them to the airport, and a jet to fly him out of the country. And one more demand.
"Well, I want them to deliver my wife here from Kings County Hospital. His name is Ernest Aaron. It's a guy. I'm gay."
This was a curveball for the cops and the media. Queer stuff was seldom discussed in public, but this was forcing them to talk about it.
Does he want his lover?
He did, and he does. We have his wife here.
To their credit, they often refer to Liz as his wife. They even use the correct feminine pronouns most of the time, even though John didn't. And they even went and they got Liz from the hospital to talk to him. Although, when she arrived...
The wife is right across the street, but refuses to go near him. She believes John to be unstable.
That was probably a good call. She never asked for this.
And you think I really wanted a person to rob a bank?
And she was right. John was unstable.
The truth is if Liz wasn't going on the plane with me to get the sex change operation, I would have blew her fucking ass away.
When word spread through the crowd that this was a queer bank robber, the mood turned. The cheers were now boos. The hostages were getting nervous, especially when police cut the phone and air conditioning. And Sal, still holding them at gunpoint, was mad that the media was calling him gay. His fear was that if they did wind up getting arrested, that would make him a target for assault in jail. And finally, the FBI told him, "All right, fine, you win. We'll help you leave the country. Just don't hurt the hostages." They brought in a van. John and Sal emerged, surrounded by the hostages, and got inside. An FBI agent drove them to JFK, and then onto the tarmac where a jet was waiting to take them overseas. Another FBI agent met the van. John was jubilant at this point. It seemed like they'd made it. They were actually going to get away with it. The agent on the tarmac told them they'd be able to board in just a minute. He turned to the driver and asked if everybody was ready. The driver nodded yes, and that was the signal. In a flash, the tarmac agent reached in and grabbed John's gun, and the driver whirled around in his seat and fired a single shot into Sal's chest. It was over in a flash. The hostages were free, John was arrested, and Sal was dead. The FBI held a press conference to announce the end of the ordeal. And the only trace of John's momentary high status was that people were still calling him Big John.
Big John, John.
Yeah, call him anything you want, but he's the one that gave up.
In the aftermath of the heist, there were a lot of rumors about it. Arthur Bell in the Village Voice reported that a lot of people believed the whole thing had been arranged by the mob, although I have a feeling that's not true. My guess is that the rumor was probably spread by people who believed John's wild claims that he'd arranged jobs for the mafia. Another rumor was that the whole thing had been arranged by the Gay Activists Alliance so they could raise money for their headquarters. That also seems unlikely, given that the leaders favored non-violent disruptions, so armed robbery would be very out of character. Not to mention, most of their members didn't even like Little John. And that presented a bit of a crisis for the organization. They had been trying desperately to get mainstream media to talk more about queer people. Now it was finally happening, but not in the way that they wanted. Should they respond to the robbery? And if so, how? That was the question at a meeting at the GAA's Firehouse headquarters one night, attended by about 150 people. On one side were a handful of folks who didn't quite defend John, but thought that somebody should. One of them was a woman named Denny Cavello, who said, "John is a political prisoner. The way the press treated it, he can't get a fair trial. No gay person can get a fair trial." She was speaking from experience. The GAA confrontational protests often led to arrests, and Denny herself had been arrested for staging a sit-in at Mayor John Lindsay's campaign office. Homosexuality was still a criminal offense in New York. Queer people were frequently arrested, and she was right that courts and cops didn't treat them fairly. But other GAA members pushed back. "I will not make a hero of John Basso," said one. "I remember him. He was a foolish little man." And they pointed out, "There is a kid who is dead. If John wanted to be a fool, why didn't he do it alone?" Ultimately, they decided they couldn't defend what John had done, but they could demand that he at least be treated fairly. They put out a statement pointing out that the justice system was prejudiced against queer people and demanded that the state consider a gay judge, that they allow gay people to serve on the jury. That might sound like a low bar, but back then, it was actually a big ask. Queer people were considered unfit to participate in the criminal justice system. Earlier that year, a court had refused to allow a gay lawyer to argue a case because he was guilty of behavior contrary to good morals and in violation of the laws of the state. And a few years later, when Dan White assassinated Harvey Milk in San Francisco, White's lawyers refused to allow any openly queer people to sit in the jury. So it's probably true that John would get harsher treatment than a straight bank robber would have. In fact, in one ruling, the judge wrote, "The defendant's sex life is an unfortunate thing." And in John's case, the government was eager to make an example and throw the book at him. The case was presided over by a young assistant U.S. attorney named Rudy Giuliani. And ultimately, John was sentenced to 20 years. But although queer people were eager to distance themselves from John, some pointed out he might have done at least some good by accident. Even a GAA figure who was no great fan of John's admitted his fairly stupid trick was admirable in admitting, in fact shouting, his homosexuality at a crucial moment in his life. It was the kind of thing that gay leaders have been trying to persuade people to do for years. To come out, make themselves known. Harvey Milk had a whole speech about it.
Gay people all across the state, the Briggs can only be defeated if each and every one of you comes out to everyone you know you must.
The media had been telling awful lies about gays, painting them as a threat, so it was up to gay people to correct them, which they could only do by coming out, being visible, countering the lies. And now, John had done just what they'd been telling everyone to do, to declare that he was gay, but unfortunately he did it just as he was actually posing a threat. So there was a lot of concern that he might have set the movement back. A Life magazine article about it used pretty negative language, describing John's time in the netherworld of New York's homosexual bars. Some gay organizations did what they could to try to control the coverage. Randy Wicker, who had videotaped John's ceremony with Liz, held a press conference to try to paint a more balanced portrait. He arranged for it to be held in a friend's luxury apartment so it didn't seem seedy, and they talked about John's good qualities in order to, as they put it, manage and influence the news, which was bound to be heavily weighted against him. And sure enough, some of the coverage was somewhat positive. One article in the gay press pointed out that it got the media to not just acknowledge the existence of queer people, but that the media tended to use our own non-medical, non-derogatory term for ourselves. Not only that, but news coverage made no attempt to connect homosexuality with gun-toting and bank robbery. Other articles used surprisingly respectful language regarding Liz. At a time when very few people understood transgender people, some news wrote that Liz is a real woman. Liz herself was given opportunities to talk about her life.
I'm a transsexual. I'm attempting to pay for a sex change, which right now it seems impossible, but I'm attempting to do it.
It's impressive that she's being given a chance to self-identify, that the media generally used the correct female pronouns, avoided using her dead name, and talked about the healthcare challenges that she faced as a trans woman. Millions of people saw these articles and broadcasts, which meant millions of people saw coverage of queer lives. Among those whose attention was caught was a Hollywood producer named Martin Bregman. He read that article in Life magazine, and his eye was caught by one line in particular, a description of John as a dark, thin fellow with the broken-faced good looks of an Al Pacino or a Dustin Hoffman. And he thought, you know what? Maybe they're onto something. Martin Bregman, the producer, started working on a film adaptation of The Heist. He knew exactly who to call to direct: Sidney Lumet. Lumet was a cinema icon. He'd made hits like 12 Angry Men, Murder on the Orient Express, and Serpico with an up-and-comer named Al Pacino. Lumet loved the concept. His films emphasized realism. They tackled stories with queer elements before, sort of. For most of his career, movies weren't allowed to include openly gay characters, but he'd managed to at least hint at their existence in films like The Pawnbroker and View from the Bridge. To write the script, they brought in Frank Pearson, an experienced screenwriter who'd worked on Cool Hand Luke and was about to start writing A Star is Born with Barbra Streisand. Sidney Lumet wanted the movie to feel like newsreel footage of the actual robbery, and Frank started researching news coverage and interviews about what John Wadowitz was like. And he ran into some problems. For one thing,
it was also contradictory. It was like every one of them knew a different person and described a different person, and I grew very depressed.
In fact, he amassed so many contradictory descriptions of the robbery, he was about to ask his agent to get him out of the project. But then he remembered.
But by then I'd spent the advance, and I didn't have the money to pay it back, so I was kind of stuck.
Fortunately, he wasn't doing this alone. Martin Bregman, the producer, knew that they'd need help to make the story feel authentic, and he hired Randy Wicker, who'd covered John and Liz's ceremony and had written extensively about the heist, to be an advisor on the film. Officially, Randy's title was Authenticity Consultant, to make sure they got the details about queer life correct. Something that's not uncommon now, but back then was almost unheard of. Another challenge was, although the queer angle is what made the story unique, it also raised some red flags. Sal's uncle told reporters, "I got nothing against bank robbers as such, but he was outraged by the suggestion that his nephew might have been gay." And that stigma extended to the film industry. Several studios rejected the project outright. By the 1970s, only a handful of movies had acknowledged queer people, and even fewer trans people. Most of those movies were underground, independent projects, or exploitation films. Movies like Glen or Glenda, or films by John Waters or Andy Warhol. There were a couple of documentary-style films that attempted to show a broader view of queer and trans life, like The Queen and Queens at Heart. But those were relatively obscure, hard to find outside of major cities. Definitely not what you'd call mainstream. And when it did come to mainstream films, on the rare occasions that a trans character did appear, they were usually portrayed as violent criminals, or played for shock, like in Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, or Reflection of Fear, or Myra Breckenridge. Even Rocky Horror, which has an exuberant gender nonconforming lead, positions him as shocking. Having a character go outside heterosexual, cisgender expectations was basically an easy way to tell an audience, this person's unwell, they're dangerous. But the Dog Day Afternoon team wanted to try something different. Here's the producer, Martin Bregman, talking about the relationship in the film between the bank robber, inspired by John, and his partner, inspired by Liz.
What was wonderful to me about it is it portrayed a life or a lifestyle that nobody had ever seen before. It was a gay relationship, but without the dirty jokes and the extent that one character went through to prove his love.
They wanted to humanize the characters, get the audience to relate to them. That was going to make casting difficult, especially for the role inspired by Liz, who they renamed Leon for the movie. They auditioned a bunch of actors, but none of them seemed right. They played the character as flamboyant, over the top, the same cartoonish tropes you'd see in other mainstream movies of the time. And then, in walked a mostly unknown actor named Chris Sarandon.
I was basically a theater actor. I'd never done a movie before. And I looked at this script and I thought, this is one of the great scripts I think I've ever read.
Chris had plenty of queer people in his life. He lived in West Hollywood. He was married to a bisexual woman, the actress Susan Sarandon, who around this time was about to start filming Rocky Horror. Chris took a different approach to the Leon character. He didn't want to be campy. He wanted to focus on the character's emotional life, especially in connection to the bank robber, who was renamed Sonny for the film. Chris said that he felt the important thing about Leon and Sonny was their relationship, not their sexual preference. I certainly didn't want to do anything that would exploit the subject matter or offend anyone, so I focused on what these two people meant to each other. Sidney Lumet, the director, loved that approach. He just had one note.
The next time, a little less Blanche Dubois, a little more Queen's Housewife. And that was the sort of key that unlocked the character.
The part was cast. But finding the lead was going to be tough, too. As Bregman told his colleagues, no major star had ever played a gay. Whether that's true depends on how you define major star, but the point held that it was very rare and considered a huge career risk. Since the Life magazine article had compared Little John to Al Pacino, that's the first place they went. Sidney had worked with him before on Serpico, and
I knew that he would never take a cheap shot. He'd never do any of the so-called homosexual cliches.
So they sent a draft of the script to Al.
And the next morning, Al said, it's a great screenplay. I love it. It's a terrific story. But I'm not going to do it.
Al Pacino had just made 4 enormous movies, and he was exhausted. He'd been drinking and felt close to burning out completely. And he had a few objections to the script. Frank Pearson had written a scene where the Leon character shows up at the bank wearing flamboyant Marilyn Monroe drag and kisses Sonny at the door. Al didn't mind kissing a male actor. He later wrote, I had been living in the village since my teens. I had friends, roommates, colleagues who were attracted to different people than I was, and none of that was ever rebellious or groundbreaking or unusual. But he thought that the Marilyn Monroe getup and the kiss would come off as a gimmick, that audiences would be so shocked it would distract from the story. Here's Frank Pearson remembering what Al said.
You don't have to keep reminding them by, pushing the gay issue here. Why can't you just make a picture about two people who love each other and cannot find a way to live with each other?
Frank realized he was right. So he retooled the script. He made a variety of changes to focus more on the relationship. And that was something that had been missing from most of the coverage of the actual bank heist. Even the positive articles presented Liz and John as funny, only in New York weirdos. Marty Bregman sent Al a revised version of the script, and
he said, please, as a friend, read it cover to cover for me. I said, okay, I'll do it. So I read it. And I just put the script down and said, Marty, I'll do it. I'm there.
Production was now zooming forward, slated to start in September of 1974. They found a warehouse in Brooklyn, close to where the actual robbery occurred, and built a reproduction of the bank that looked so authentic.
Literally, the first 4 days, strangers stop by and want to open an account.
Filming began with the opening moments of the heist, arriving at the bank, taking up their positions. But Al felt that something was off. After filming the first day's scenes, he sat with the producer and watched the footage. He was playing the character calm, in control, not too different from his character in The Godfather, the character that John had found so inspiring for the real-life heist. But what Al was seeing up on screen felt to him like a pale imitation of a pale imitation. When the lights came up, Al leaned over to Marty and he whispered, "We have to shoot this over again." Marty freaked out. "What do you mean?" he shouted. And Al, who'd played so many tough guys, was so scared that he was in trouble that he got up and ran from the room. Later, he explained he just wanted to take a different approach, that he wasn't sure yet what that approach was. The team talked it over, and they said, all right, he could have one day to come up with some new way to play the character. So Al went home to the Upper East Side apartment where he was staying. It was a tiny hole in the wall that made him feel safe because it reminded him of the Bronx tenements where he'd grown up. He spent the night pacing the floor, drinking wine, trying to figure the character out, where he was emotionally, why he was doing what he was doing. He later wrote that it was like trying to compose an entire sonata overnight. And when he came back the next day, Al was jittery. He was frantic, clumsy. Around the set, there were whispers of concern. They thought maybe Al was having a nervous breakdown. And that certainly is the vibe in the scenes as captured on film. In the opening scenes, we meet the three robbers, Sonny, Stevie, and Sal. They charge into the bank, but it is immediately obvious they have no idea what they're doing.
Nobody move! Get over there!
Stevie chickens out and runs immediately, just like Bobby had in real life.
I can't do it, Sonny.
Oh, fuck me.
And Sonny, already nervous, freaks out when he realizes the vault is nearly empty. Just like in real life, the cops arrive before they can flee. So, Sonny and Sal, scared for their lives but trying not to show it, take the hostages. And as a crowd gathers outside, Sonny tries to come up with a plan.
All right, I gotta have time to think now. I gotta think.
This wasn't a nervous breakdown on Al's part. It was a choice to play the character not as a suave, confident con man, but as a terrified loser. And the big breakthrough that Al had come up with the night before is that secretly, Sonny wants to get caught, so he doesn't have to go through with the heist. It's a fascinating choice. Remember, the goal of the production was to humanize the characters, to get the audience to understand them. Making Sonny a fuck-up is a great way to do that. In these opening minutes, he comes off not as dangerous, but funny.
Sal, what? Where are you?
Who hasn't made plans that go embarrassingly wrong? He's so clearly scared that it's hard to not feel some sympathy for him. When Sidney Lumet saw what Al had done, he knew this was the right decision. With this performance, he thought, the audience would identify with the character enough that when things go south, viewers have already decided they kind of like him. And things definitely go south.
What did you do, just barge in on a whim? Huh?
Look, I told you to get out of here when you could, but no, you just had to hang around.
He don't have a plan. It's all a whim.
And when he decides to hold the employees as hostages...
Listen.
What?
I'm never gonna make this. I'll have to go to the toilet.
He comes off like a frazzled dad with a car full of kids he doesn't know how to handle.
All right, who has to go to the bathroom here?
I do too.
Oh, you see, now they all want to go.
But the more serious issue is the fact that there are a million cops outside with guns pointed directly at him. When he comes out of the bank and sees all the cops lined up, ready to shoot, he realizes just how much danger he's in. There's a scene where he talks it over with the bank manager.
See what they did in Attica? 42 people they killed. The innocent with the guilty.
He's talking about that 1971 prison riot in New York, where police went in, guns blazing, and killed a ton of people. And an audience of that time would probably also be thinking about the recent massacre at Kent State, where the National Guard fired on student protesters and killed 4 of them. Or Jackson State, where police shot into a crowd of student protesters and killed 2. Or the Orangeburg Massacre, when police fired on a crowd protesting segregation and killed 3. And right there in New York City, the Hard Hat Riot, when police encouraged construction workers to beat up Vietnam War protesters. Sonny and everyone else there knows the cops could get violent again. But there's an important difference now. Just like in real life, in the movie, the bank is surrounded by media, broadcasting updates, providing a play-by-play on radio and television. And at first, the people in the bank are charmed by all that attention, even Sonny.
Why are you doing this? Hello?
See? No, I just saw myself. What? Why am I doing it?
When Sonny steps outside with a hostage to show the police that she's okay, she has a chance to talk to some reporters, and when she comes back inside, listen to how delighted she is.
Put the TV on.
Girls, I was interviewed.
It seems crazy given that they're being held at gunpoint, but the attention is intoxicating. To become a main character for a moment can make a person feel special. But to Sonny, there's something more important going on than just a few minutes in the limelight. When he goes outside, listen to the crowd's response. Yeah! And watch how Sonny responds.
Go back there, man! Get over there, will ya?
Why are the police letting Sonny tell them what to do? Well, he thinks he knows.
If it wasn't for the TV guys, they'd kill us all!
He said if it wasn't for the TV guys, they'd kill us all. And he's probably right. While the police may have no qualms about killing innocent people, they don't want it broadcast on the evening news.
Cops don't like it in the papers when they shoot a married woman.
This is similar to John's realization during the real-life heist. We knew they were going to blow us away, he said, so he kept talking to reporters because the more publicity we got, the safer we were. In the film, Sonny goes even further, calling out to the crowd. After so many high-profile, violent incidents from the police, everybody knows what he's talking about. The police don't care about your life, so whose side are you people on? First, the movie got the audience on Sonny's side, and now Sonny has the crowd on his side. At one point, the hostages request some food, and when a kid comes to deliver them, listen to how the crowd roars. And watch this kid's response.
I will fucking stop!
It's a moment that feels so current, like somebody whose Twitch channel just got raided by a big streamer. Just being close to the action for a moment is dazzling. And to put this in contemporary terms, Sonny knows he's got to keep his view counts up. Because as long as people are talking about him, the police won't dare hurt him. Visibility is keeping him alive. Visibility equals survival. But that safety is put to the test as night falls. Just like in real life, Sonny tells the cops that he wants them to bring his wife to the scene. The film leads you to expect that means his ex-wife, Carmen, and even has a scene where police go to her apartment.
You know, his mother says we was always fighting, the cops was always at our house.
But then, who do they wind up bringing to the bank?
Step back. Let's get back.
This is Chris Sarandon's character, inspired by Liz, referred to in the film as Leon. Initially, the police are pretty derisive about her.
He's a queer?
They're used to queer people being freaks, someone to laugh at, push around. Remember, this takes place in 1972, just a few years after the cops raided Stonewall. And if past movies were any guide, audiences might expect the film to take a similar tone. But Sidney Lumet was focused on giving the characters more depth. As he put it, to show the audience that what seem like freaks aren't really the freaks you think they are. So, how would he pull that off? Well, it happens during another plot beat pulled from real life. A phone call between Sonny in the bank and Leon across the street.
Hello, Leon?
Hello, Sonny.
It starts with some small talk that paints a picture of their relationship.
How you doing?
I'm out of the hospital.
You know, I thought you'd never get out.
I never thought I'd get out this way, I'll tell you.
Neither one knows exactly what to say.
So, how are you?
I'm fine.
I find that line so tragically funny. Sonny saying he's fine, even though he's robbing a bank and has all those guns pointed at him. He's obviously not fine, he knows that. He's just trying to act like he's in control. But he's not even in control of this conversation.
I don't know, Leon, you know, I'm dying. Yeah.
Well, you're not dying, you're killing the people around you is what you're doing.
Sonny tries to assert himself as the hero.
You needed money? I got your money, that's it.
But Leon's response?
Yeah. Well, I didn't ask you to go and rob a bank.
And when Sonny tries to get Leon to join him...
If you wanted to, you can come with me.
I've been trying to get away from you for 6 months, and I'm going to go with you on a plane trip, huh?
Leon rejects what Sonny's doing, and he rejects any attempt to get them back together.
What are you going to do?
I thought that I would go back to the hospital.
Leon's one of the only people who really knows Sonny, and he knows they don't belong together.
What am I supposed to say to you?
Thanks a lot, and bon voyage.
Although they never say it directly, with this phone call, we're watching them both acknowledge this is the end of their relationship.
See you sometime.
Yeah, I'll see you in my dreams, huh?
For anyone who's been through a bad breakup, this feels so heart-wrenching and genuine.
This wasn't a relationship about a drag queen and his boyfriend. This was a relationship of two people who were trying to come to grips with what is wrong in their relationship.
After he hangs up, Sonny tries to call his ex-wife, and that goes even worse. They just wind up shouting at each other and he hangs up. Sidney Lumet shot both of these calls back-to-back, 2 long, exhausting conversations with no break between them for the actors. It was genuinely exhausting. And after Sonny hangs up, there's a moment when he looks to the side. What's happening there is he's glancing at Lumet to see if that was the end of the take.
My face was right next to the lens, and he had moved me so. With the second one, there were tears running down my face. And he looked, and he caught my eyes, and he burst into tears and then just lowered his head.
What Sonny thought would be a cool adventure has now left him completely alone and terrified. In real life, when the crowd found out that at least one of the bank robbers was queer, they turned hostile. And as the movie goes on, news spreads about Leon.
Police are questioning Leon Shermer, a 26-year-old admitted homosexual who claims to have been married to one of the bank robbers in a ceremony last November.
Queer groups debate how to respond.
Phone calls have begun to arrive at our switchboard from various factions of the gay community, some in full support of Sonny and his actions, others totally condemning the present events and calling the marriage a farce and a case of sheer exhibitionism.
And we see some gay activists arrive with a banner supporting Sonny. If you listen carefully, you can hear the rest of the crowd booing them. The script even called for members of the crowd to start fighting with the gay activists. And although that doesn't appear in the final version of the film, the crowd's attitude is decidedly hostile now. Why has he lost their sympathy? Well, they didn't see what we did. The funny bumbling in the bank, the heartfelt call with Leon. They missed the moments that made him human. And now, to them, he's just another queer. They might not care so much about the cops shooting him. The media visibility that was protecting him before has turned Sonny into a target. The cops pose more of a threat now, too. The FBI has taken over, and they have a more strategic approach than the New York police. The FBI agents make a show of being unarmed, not a threat, just trying to end things peacefully. It's going to be hard for Sonny to turn the crowd against them since they don't seem as scary or dangerous as the New York police. Although Sonny can see they mean business.
You'd like to kill me,
I wouldn't like to kill you. I will if I have to.
He realizes the FBI is closing in, that the crowd isn't with them anymore. Sonny's starting to think he might not get out of this alive.
To my darling wife, Leon.
There's a somber scene where he dictates his will.
Whom I love more than any man has loved another man.
And he includes this.
I leave $2,700 for your sex change operation.
This was one of the scenes that Lumet was the most concerned about, that people would laugh at a genuine expression of queer people in love, or at somebody talking about a trans person in serious terms. So much of this movie was going in uncharted directions that when one of Al Pacino's friends, the actor Charlie Lawton, came to set, he told Al afterwards, "Do you know what it's like? It's like pulling the pin out of a hand grenade and waiting for it to explode." Finally, after hours of waiting, the FBI tells Sonny they've arranged a jet to fly them out of the country. Just like in real life, they send a limo, everybody gets in, and on the drive to the airport, the film emphasizes how public opinion about Sonny has shifted. But Sonny doesn't care. They make it to the airport, the jet's waiting, he can't believe they're getting away with this.
I'll be a son of a bitch, we did it.
And even if you know how the real-life robbery went, it looks like, wow, maybe in the movie version, they're actually going to pull this off.
You ready to get out first?
I'm ready.
Or not. There's no media around to see the FBI kill Sal, arrest Sonny, and get the hostages out. As he's being cuffed, he looks across the tarmac, and he sees that the hostages are safe. There's a tiny trace of a smile, like he's relieved it's all over and they're okay. But then Sal's body is wheeled past. He realizes the consequences of his actions, and he hangs his head in agonized guilt. This is another departure from real life, since John seldom, if ever, acknowledged his role in his friend's death. Filming was finished in November of 1974, and that was a bit of a challenge, since the cold nights made everybody's breath visible. During some of the outdoor scenes, the actors had to hold ice cubes in their mouths to hide the condensation. And as they prepared for the movie's release the following year, Warner Brothers faced a new challenge: convincing people to come see it. There was a lot of concern at the studio that nobody would buy tickets to a movie with queer characters. So their solution was not to tell anybody. The trailer just alludes to it.
If a writer had thought up this story, it would be dismissed as too weird, too unbelievable.
but it did happen in Brooklyn. It did capture the curiosity of the entire country.
But a lot of queer people knew exactly what this movie was going to be about, since the holdup had become so notorious. There was a lot of anxiety that after John had made them look bad, this movie could make them look even worse. In part, that's because Dog Day Afternoon was coming out the same time as another movie with a queer angle, Freebie and the Bean, which has a surprise twist at the end involving a yet another killer transvestite character. Some gay organizers didn't wait for Dog Day Afternoon to come out. They were sure it would be just one more exploitative movie looking down its nose at anything queer, and they called for a boycott. Others took a wait-and-see approach. When the film finally hit theaters in September of 1975, queer reviewers reluctantly went to see it, fearing the worst, and they found, actually, it's pretty good. One critic at a gay newspaper wrote, "Probably for the first time in the lives of most straight audience members, they learned to not judge a man solely on the strength or weakness of his sexual disposition." Another wrote that it took the gay community off the back pages of the National Enquirer and out into the area of serious public discussion. Even the group calling for a boycott begrudgingly called it unfortunately well made, which is a great line for a poster, but most queer critics didn't see it as unfortunate at all. They were pleasantly surprised by all the work to humanize the characters. Of course, there was still the fact that at the end of the day, Sonny wasn't exactly an angel. The writer and activist Vito Russo acknowledged, "Yes, we are bank robbers too, but I don't think it was the first thing we had to share with the masses. It will not make them suddenly realize we are their children." But, as another critic wrote, if straight audiences could at least see the humanity in these characters and reconsider some negative stereotypes, Dog Day Afternoon will have done much good for humanity. So, how would straight audiences receive the film? Nobody was more concerned about that than Sidney Lumet. He was especially anxious about the moment when Leon is revealed.
And that's when I was afraid the house would explode with laughter.
Chris Sarandon was anxious too. After the film opened, he worked up the nerve to sneak into a theater. And when his character steps out of the car?
And when my character first entered, I thought, oh, here it comes. And there was some hooting and hollering and whistling and laughing.
It was exactly what they were afraid of. But then,
after that, it quieted down. The scene in the barbershop got some laughs, but they were real laughs. They weren't laughter at the character, but laughter at the situation and the way he's describing it.
And by the time Sonny and Leon talk on the phone?
It was dead quiet. And I thought, wow, we did our job.
The New York Times called it one of the best New York movies ever made. Critics called out the queer characters in particular, calling Sarandon's performance memorably dignified. And those concerns that people wouldn't come to see a movie with queer leads turned out to be overblown. On a budget of $4 million, it made over $50 million. That's equivalent to around $300 million in today's money. For comparison, about what an average Marvel movie takes in. Dog Day Afternoon was nominated for 20 awards, winning 14, including Best Original Screenplay. A huge vindication for having a queer person consulting on the script. There had only been a handful of movies with queer leads in the past. This one became a cultural phenomenon.
Sidney Lumet came up to me at one point and said, this is out of our hands. This thing is its own life.
A film like this could never have been made, even a few years earlier, under film censorship rules. Now, not only was mainstream media putting queer people in front of millions of Americans, it was doing it with relatable, likable characters. Not coded, not sly innuendo, but directly identified as part of a community that had barely ever been mentioned in the past. This was far from the end of the story, for the movie and for the real-life figures who inspired it. Warner Brothers paid each of them a few $1,000s for their stories, plus a little more to Liz, who sued them for more and settled for an undisclosed payout. And from prison, John directed his lawyer to send some of the money that he got to Liz, enough to pay for the surgery that she wanted. So, in a funny way, John's bank heist did, ultimately, pay for her operation. In the years that followed, Liz wrote, "I've just turned 30, and I am happier than I ever thought I would be. I have a man I love, a few close friends, peace of mind. If that's all life brings me, I'll be happy." John was eventually paroled, moved back to New York, where he was met with a certain amount of notoriety.
One man living in this Fleabag hotel can lay claim to being one of the most celebrated losers in recent times.
But as far as he was concerned, there's no such thing as bad publicity.
When the movie came out, that became the essence of his life. He then became the dog, and there was a real personality change of a major degree.
With a less than sterling resume, John mainly rode the fame from his association with the film. He insisted that people call him Dog, a nickname he'd never had before. He applied for a job at the same bank that he robbed. After he was, of course, turned down, he hung out there in a shirt that said, "I robbed this bank." He'd do interviews, pose for photos, sign autographs, and he eked out a living as a weird micro-celebrity. There was the occasional documentary that caught up with John from time to see what he was up to.
What type of a job would you like to have?
Well, anything that's got to do with bookkeeping or anything that's got to do with finance.
But although he faded into obscurity, queer characters in movies did the exact opposite. One of the most fascinating gay movies of the late 70s is one called Cruising. It was made by William Friedkin, who'd previously done The Exorcist. I have a separate video on my channel all about Cruising, but it's about a cop going undercover in gay bars to catch a serial killer, coincidentally also starring Al Pacino. And when you compare Cruising to Dog Day Afternoon, you can see just how different, and I think better, Sidney Lumet's approach was. For one thing, Sidney Lumet worked with a queer consultant on the script. Friedkin did his research by infiltrating gay bars with help from straight cops and friends of the mob, and he tried to figure out the scene all by himself instead of asking literally any gay person to be his guide. Another difference is that Friedkin made Cruising from the cop's point of view, looking into the bars as alien and scary. You're never on the queer character's side because the movie keeps them at arm's length. And there's not much depth to any of them. They're either perfectly virtuous or depraved killers. None of the gays come across as particularly human. Dog Day Afternoon gave us such complex queer characters in 1975. In comparison, 1980s Cruising feels like an old-timey throwback to before when mainstream movies figured out just how interesting gay leads could be. But unfortunately, Cruising wound up being a forecast of what was about to come. The presidential election of 1980 ushered in a radically homophobic regime to the White House, and with it came a huge cultural backslide. Film and TV studios saw Reagan's election as a signal that Americans wanted conservative entertainment, and as soon as he came to power, they started stripping out queer themes and characters. Projects in the works were canceled, like an American adaptation of La Cage aux Folles, that wouldn't come to screens until over a decade later as The Birdcage. Other projects that had gay characters saw them turn straight, like the show Dynasty.
I'm offering you a chance to straighten yourself out.
Or eliminated, like when the movie Fame was turned into a TV series, they removed the gay character. Movie executives reacted with horror whenever they saw something gay on screen.
At the part in the movie where the two men embrace and kiss, he jumped up and he said, "You made a goddamn f***ing movie," and stalked out.
Entertainment changed even faster than it had in the 1970s. Complex queer leads, like in Dog Day Afternoon, suddenly got very scarce in mainstream US movies. So what remained were sidekicks. Now, I love a good gay sidekick. They're fun, they're fashionable, they're usually running circles around everybody else.
Two things I love to do. It's fight and kiss boys. Come on.
But as side characters, they simply can't have the depth of a lead role. They might be likable, but they weren't nearly as relatable. Mainstream movies in the 80s also saw a surge in crazy queer killers, like in Sleepaway Camp. And movies where homosexuality is a threat, like Nightmare on Elm Street 2, which is full of metaphors for the fear of being gay.
Something is trying to get inside my body.
Yeah, and she's female and she's waiting for you in the cabana. And you want to sleep with me.
That would continue into the 90s, with some of the worst depictions yet. Movies like Ace Ventura, with a jaw-dropping conclusion where a violent assault on a trans person is played for laughs. And then there's Silence of the Lambs, with another crazed gender-bending killer. To be fair, Silence of the Lambs includes dialogue to distance the killer from the trans community.
There's no correlation in the literature between transsexualism and violence. Transsexuals are very passive.
Billy is not a real transsexual, but he thinks he is. He tries to be.
It's similar to the technique used 10 years earlier in William Friedkin's movie Cruising, which opened with some titles to note that it didn't represent all homosexuals, and a dubbed line when this character has his back to the audience.
Lucas and Vincent were not in the mainstream of gay life. They were into heavy leather.
Basically, using a marginalized group for titillation, and then trying to cover themselves with a not all queers disclaimer. And that was a nuance that most audiences simply ignored. After Silence of the Lambs came out, news articles described the murderer variously as a crossdresser, a transsexual, homosexual, gay. Audiences might not have agreed on what kind of queer he was, but they were pretty confident he was one of them. What's so discouraging is that in the mid-70s, films like Dog Day Afternoon were so humane and thoughtful and good that progress happened so fast, and it seemed like it would only continue. But when you compare those movies to what was coming out in the 80s and even into the 90s, you can see just how delicate that progress really was, and how long it could take to get it back. It took decades for media images of queer people to claw back that complexity and depth in major films. There were a few exceptions, like Philadelphia or The Hours, But for most of the 80s and 90s, you had to seek out small indie films or foreign movies if you wanted to see queer leads. And even into the 2000s, in big-budget Hollywood films, they tended to be just sidekicks. Fun sidekicks, sure, but never the focus. There was a breakthrough in 2004, Brokeback Mountain. It was a romance about two cowboys. News coverage treated it like such a thing in a mainstream film was unthinkable, asking, is America ready for this movie? As if it hadn't been ready and waiting since the 1970s. Gradually, into the 2000s and 2010s, queer characters gained back more prominence. Once again, they could be heroes or villains. They could be people figuring themselves out. Like in the 70s, they could be sexually adventurous or family-oriented. There were mainstream movies that acknowledged queer people have always existed, and even put trans people front and center. It was such a shift that Time magazine even had a cover in 2014 declaring it the transgender tipping point. It seemed like, finally, we were on the cusp of a new golden age for queer characters on screen. Diverse, fully realized, relatable, human. So, what happened? Well, you might have noticed that we've had a few devastating elections here in the US. The first in 2016, ushering in what was, at that point, the worst presidential administration in modern times. That coincided with another particularly bad cultural backlash, especially targeted at trans people. The mid-2010s saw a surge in violent transphobia. People started losing their minds over issues that had never been a problem before. Trans people in bathrooms, playing sports, attending school. It's probably not a coincidence that that happened just as the issue of marriage equality was settled, both in legal courts and the court of public opinion. Conservatives found they were suddenly on the losing side of an issue that had always given them a convenient scapegoat. So they went after the next most vulnerable group, trans people, especially trans women. It turns out there was a transgender tipping point, just not the one that we were hoping for. And now, in 2025, we're living through the latest worst presidential administration of our lifetimes. And it's coming with an even more aggressive attack on queer rights, especially for trans people. And this time, media companies are playing along, removing queer characters from movies and shows just like in the 1980s. Disney Pixar axed a trans character named Kai from the series Win or Lose, saying that parents might find the character objectionable. The show Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur was put on hold due to a trans character. And the fact that we're losing visibility for queer characters is very alarming. It's not just about being represented on screen, although that is nice. It's also about the impact of that visibility, how important visibility is for survival. For example, in 2022, a trans legislator named Zoe Zephyr was elected in Montana. Soon after she took her seat, she spoke out against bills that would have restricted medical care for trans people, saying that Republicans had blood on their hands. In response, Republicans banned her from speaking on the House floor, saying that she'd disrupted and disturbed orderly proceedings. For a while, Zoe wasn't allowed to give speeches, effectively silenced, made invisible. But now she's back, and you can see how important it is for her to be there. Just last month, Republicans introduced bills that would have banned people from wearing clothes that didn't align with their gender at birth, and would have required that the state take trans kids away from their parents. The sponsor accused drag performers and trans people of being nothing more than a fetish. But Zephyr was there to give a powerful speech. Here she is.
And I'm here to stand before the body and say that my life is not a fetish. My existence is not a fetish.
She pointed out that she has a son, who many of her colleagues have met.
When I go to walk him to school, that is not a lascivious display. That is not a fetish. That is my family. This is what these bills are trying to come after. This is a way to target the trans community.
After that speech and others from her colleagues, 29 Republicans switched sides on the bills and voted them down. Here's one of those Republicans.
I'm very emotional because I know the representative in C-20 is also a parent. No matter what you think of that, she is doing her best to raise a child.
If Representative Zephyr hadn't been able to speak, if she was still silenced, this might never have happened. It's such a clear example of how important visibility is to survival, how insisting on being seen can have an impact. Now, her colleagues are fortunate enough to have an outspoken queer person working alongside them. But that's not the case for everyone. Some people don't know any queer people. Others don't know that they know. Others avoid queer people altogether. So how can they be reached? Through the media, with queer characters on TV and in film. Realistic, diverse, fully human depictions. showing the reality of their lives, showing people just what Sidney Lumet was thinking when he made Dog Day Afternoon. The people you assume are freaks are much more than most people think, and we're all much more connected than we know. Now, there are a lot more great stories about Dog Day Afternoon that I just didn't have room for in this video, like all the messy, dumb mistakes that the real-life bank robbers made, the extraordinary lengths the filmmakers went to for the sake of realism, and the secret work that Al Pacino did on behalf of the queer community in the 1980s. I'm posting bonus videos with all those stories and hours more over at patreon.com/mattbaum. And for even more stories about how Hollywood entertainment and real-life activists have overlapped over the years, check out my book about the history of queer characters on sitcoms. It's called Hi Honey, I'm Homo. It's available wherever you get books, and you can get a signed, personalized copy if you go to gaysitcoms.com. Huge thanks to everybody who makes these videos possible with your membership on Patreon. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm about to have a Dog Day Afternoon of my own.
Here we go.